Our next speaker is Professor Hans Christian von Herrmann, Professor of Literary Criticism at Technische Universität Berlin. And he has also been a visiting professor at the University of Duisburg-Essen, Princeton, Free University of Berlin, University of Constance, and here at NYU, where he is currently teaching a graduate seminar entitled Information Society. Among his many publications are Zank der Maschinen, Brechts Medienästhetik, 1996, Archiv der Bühne, eine Archäologie des Theaters und seine Wissenschaft, 2005. And the title of his talk for today is Media Culture, Bildung in the Age of Information, Marshall McLuhan, Jean-François Lyotard, and Friedrich Kittler. Please welcome Professor Herrmann.
Yeah, sorry for the subtitle of my talk. I will explain it. So first of all, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much. Many thanks to Avital, Ronell, and Arne Höcker for inviting me and letting me be part of this wonderful conference. First of all, I would like, to thank. I did this. The subject that I have chosen resonates in many ways with the discussions we had here yesterday, especially the issue of teaching and learning. But I think I will give no final answer to this question either, because I only would like to point out that Friedrich Kittler's writings are questioning to a very large extent the institutional framework of the university, starting with a radical challenge or provocation of the language game of the humanities. I am taking as my point of departure a short YouTube video entitled Friedrich Kittler, Abschied von der Sophienstraße. It shows an improvised 10-minute talk given at an event in Berlin in July 2011, which must have been Friedrich Kittler's last public appearance. In spite of the occasion, Kittler is not looking back on the years he spent in the rear of Sophienstraße 22 as professor for the history and aesthetics of media. Instead, he is talking about the joy of teaching and the joy of learning, starting with the first line of Sophocles' tragedy, Oedipus the Tyrant, Kinder, ihr des alten Kadmos, junge Brut, my children, latest generation, born from Cadmus. Kittler's message here is obvious. We, as scholars, are all children of the Greek alphabet, born from this unique technology that brought together music, mathematics, and poetics through a single coding system. This has been the well-known leitmotif in Friedrich Kittler's writings since the year 2000, when he decided to run through the notorious path from Plato to NATO in the opposite direction. But this is not what I will talk about today. What I would like to highlight is just the simple fact that the pivotal word in Friedrich Kittler's last public speech is paideia, which does not mean a transfer of knowledge or a transfer of rules of behavior, but instead indicates a comprehensive orientation of all teaching and learning between the generations. No one would argue that what Friedrich Kittler had in mind was a simple return to the German humanist Bildung of the 1800s, although the bias towards ancient Greece is closely related to that concept. So what could paideia mean in the context of media studies, in the sense Friedrich Kittler had conceived it? In other words, what could paideia mean in the context of a digital media culture? Or in what sense is it possible to speak of Bildung in the age of information? But before I start, I want to explain the second part of my lecture's subtitle, which situates Friedrich Kittler in a series together with two other names, Marshall McLuhan and Jean-François Lyotard. The basis for that is that both of the latter published books that deal to a large extent with the issue of paideia, Bildung, or education, and which were primarily written by by order of educational institutions. I'm talking about Marshall McLuhan's 1964 book, Understanding Media, and Jean-François Lyotard's 1979 book, La Condition Postmoderne, Rapport sur le Savoir. As the subtitle indicates, Lyotard presented his book as a report to the president of the Conseil de l'Université of the government of Quebec before publishing it. Likewise, McLuhan's study, Understanding Media, is the revised version of a report he wrote for the National Association of Educational Broadcasters in the United States in 1960. In contrast to these two books, Friedrich Kittler's groundbreaking treatise Aufschreibesysteme 1800-1900, Discourse Networks 1800-1900, first published in 1985, was a purely academic project, but nevertheless it can be read as an examination of the discourse network that constituted the German university since the 1800s, and as a polemic proposal for a fundamental reconstruction of this institution. This is what I would like to outline in my talk today. Let us begin with Marshall McLuhan. The issue with which McLuhan's book Understanding Media addressed at the beginning of the 1960s was the painful discrepancy between the everyday culture of electric or electronic media on the one hand, and on the other hand, the institutions and routines of a modern educational system entirely based on printed knowledge. In the famous 1969 interview he gave to Playboy magazine, McLuhan discussed extensively the rupture between the traditional educational system and the new living environment constituted by electric and electronic media like radio and television. For McLuhan, it was the task of media studies in the sense of media history and media aesthetics to make this rupture clearly visible so that new concepts of education could arise. On the one hand, we have the literate culture with its analytical practices of elementary segmentation and visual abstraction, and on the other hand, we have the highly immersive and synesthetic culture of electric and electronic media that is programming and industrializing the human senses. The locale where this clash of different media cultures takes place and becomes so painful is to begin with the classrooms of primary schools, where children raised in a world of new media are forced by their teachers to enter the Gutenberg galaxy. Let me quote a passage from the interview. Playboy. The name of the interviewer was Eric Norden. Might it be possible for the TV child to make the adjustment to his educational environment by synthesizing traditional literate visual forms with the insights of his own electric culture, or must the medium of print be totally unassimilable for him? McLuhan. Such a synthesis is entirely possible and could create a creative blend of the two cultures if the educational establishment were aware that there is an electric culture. In the absence of such an awareness, of such an elementary awareness, I'm afraid that the television child has no future in our schools. You must remember that the TV child has been relentlessly opposed to all the adult news of the modern world, war, racial discrimination, rioting, crime, inflation, sexual revolution. Playboy. If you had children young enough to belong to the TV generation, how would you educate them? McLuhan. Certainly not in our current schools, which are intellectual panel institutions. In today's world, to paraphrase Jefferson, the least education is the best education, since very few young minds can survive the intellectual torches of our educational system. The mosaic image of the TV screen generates a depth involving nowness and simultaneity in the lives of children that makes them scorn the distant, visualized goals of traditional education as unreal, relevant and puerile. Another basic problem is that in our schools there is simply too much to learn by the traditional analytic methods. This is an age of information overload. The only way to make the schools other than prisons without bars is to start fresh with new techniques and values. End of quote. We don't need no education. This famous line from Pink Floyd's 1979 album The Wall can be heard as a short summary of McLuhan's position towards the educational system of his time. But as we heard, it was also his ambition as a scholar to generate awareness of the present cultural split, not in order to abandon literacy, but in order to enable a creative blend of the old and the new. The way to get there was a specific form of aesthetic and historic analysis that McLuhan developed in his lectures, interviews, and books. It was, as one could say, a transformation of the tools of literary criticism into analytic tools for the aesthetics of new media and the way in which the sensorium of modern man has been shaped by media technologies. This is exactly the point where Friedrich Kittler took over and from which he continued when he started to write his book, Discourse Networks 1800-1900. Certainly the theoretical background was different. It can be designated by the buzzword French theory. It was French theory that after World War II brought Heidegger and Nietzsche back to Germany by displacing them in the context of structuralism. But what Friedrich Kittler found in these texts was also something different. He saw that French theory was, at least in part, American theory because it had blended structuralist linguistics with game theory, information theory, and cybernetics, all developed in the United States during the 1940s. So the Austreibung des Geistes aus den Geisteswissenschaften, the expulsion of spirit from the humanities that Kittler set on the agenda was from the beginning a turn to applied mathematics mediated through French structuralism. But anyway, there are also other traces in Friedrich Kittler's writing that lead back to the history of science of the 1940s. Gottfried Benn, for example, in his narrative Der Radardenker, written in 1949, but, like the second part of Goethe's Faust, published only posthumously, already intercepted the advent of cybernetics as a new science and a new concept of engineering. I quote a short passage from this remarkable text. Haben Sie sich schon einmal klargemacht, dass nahezu alles, was die Menschheit heutigen Tages noch denkt, Denken nennt, bereits von Maschinen gedacht werden kann, hergestellt von der Kybernetik, der neuen Schöpfungswissenschaft. Und diese Maschinen übertrumpfen den Menschen, die Ventile sind präziser, die Sicherungen sind stabiler als in unseren zerklafterten Wracks. Sie arbeiten Buchstaben in Töne um und liefern Gedächtnisse für 8 Stunden. Kranke Teile werden herausgeschnitten und durch neue ersetzt. Also das Gedankliche geht in die Roboter. Have you ever realized that virtually everything mankind still thinks today, everything called thought, can already be thought by machines, generated through cybernetics, the new science of creation? And these machines actually outperform human beings. Their valves are more precise, their fuses are more robust than in our ruinous wrecks. They rework letters into sound and have memories for 8 hours. Sick parts are cut out and are replaced by new parts. Thus, thought processes are transferred to robots. End quote. What Ben realizes here in the years after World War II is the emergence of an age where creation, or Schöpfung, has become an affair of new sciences and technologies subsumed under the name of cybernetics. So literature has to acknowledge that its own task has been taken over by machines. The thought of every age is reflected in its technique, Norbert Wiener proclaimed in his famous 1948 book. According to this, Hitler's discourse networks, 1800-1900, is the story of experimental scientists like Helmholtz and engineers like Edison, dethroning poets and philosophers like Goethe and Hegel at the end of the 19th century. So one could say that the story Kittler is telling us leads from literary poetics to techno-poetics. Starting with a reading of Goethe's Faust as the tragedy of a new type of scholar devoted not to the Babylonian entanglement of letters, but to the unity of Geist, the first part of Discourse Networks, 1800-1900, delivers a discourse analysis of the modern German university founded in Berlin by Friedrich Schleiermacher and Wilhelm von Humboldt at the beginning of the 19th century. This university had put philosophy, with its basic concepts of Geist and Bildung, at the top of all academic disciplines. The second part of the book specifies a new media culture which replaces the academic discourse network of 1800 by a new technical network of data processing. So the era of Geisteswissenschaften comes to an end at precisely that historic moment when their name was coined by Wilhelm Dilthey. Media determine our situation, which in spite or because of it deserves a description. Often only the first part of this famous phrase at the beginning of Friedrich Kittler's 1986 book, Gramophone Film Typewriter, is cited, but it is the description which is crucial here. Media determine our situation. This says more or less the same as the phrase we are living in a technological age. But the question is how to describe this fact or destiny. Therefore, like for Marshall McLuhan, media studies for Friedrich Kittler have never been a simple techno-determinist attitude towards cultural history, but a project in transition and an elucidation of a groundbreaking dislocation in the tectonics of knowledge as a whole. This becomes explicit in a 1993 article Friedrich Kittler wrote for the Frankfurter Rundschau, entitled Den Riss zwischen Schreiben und Lesen überwinden, Overcoming the Rift Between Writing and Reading. I quote: Wenn die Geisteswissenschaften einer Epoche des vollendeten Alphabetismus entsprungen sind, dann haben sie heute auf eine Lage zu antworten, die nach einer Kurzformel Wilhelm Flussers vom Auszug der Zahlen aus dem Alphabet gekennzeichnet wird. Die Aufgabe lautet also nicht mehr, viele Bücher durch Verstehen auf einen einheitlichen Sinn zu reduzieren. Erstens gibt es außer Büchern technische Medien, die den traditionellen Begriff des Geistes untergraben. Zweitens gibt es außer Alltagssprachen formale Sprachen aus Zahlencodes, die auch noch den tradierten Begriff des Verstehens abweisen. Medien lassen sich nicht zum Vehikel des Geistes machen, sondern nur benutzen und steuern. Formeln lassen sich lesen und schreiben, aber schlechthin nicht interpretieren. Unter solchen Bedingungen haben die Geisteswissenschaften, die aus besagten Gründen besser Kulturwissenschaften hießen, nur die Alternative, sich entweder abzuschaffen oder zu ändern. If the humanities arose from an era of complete literacy, then today they have to react to a situation which, according to a short formula by Wilhelm Flusser, is characterized by the exodus of the numbers from the alphabet. So the task is no longer reducing many books to a homogeneous meaning. Firstly, they are not only books, but also technical media, which undermine the traditional concept of Geist. And secondly, there are not only natural languages, but also formal languages of numerical codes, which repel the traditional concept of understanding. Media cannot be turned into a vehicle for Geist. They can only be used and controlled. Mathematical formula can be read and written, but definitely not interpreted. Under these conditions, die Geisteswissenschaften, which for these reasons should really be called Kulturwissenschaften, have only the choice to do away with themselves or to change. end quote. It is a fact that Geisteswissenschaften in Germany since then, 1993, have neither been abolished nor have abolished themselves, but they have changed considerably. To a very large extent, they have become Kulturwissenschaften. Reading and interpreting does not simply mean understanding anymore, but follows not only forms of knowledge, but also the poetic, rhetorical, and technical processes from which cultural artifacts emerge. The humanities have rarely included the reading and writing of digital codes in their curricula, but they have at least become aware of the epistemological and aesthetic impact of computers. But all in all, one must admit in the end that a fundamental reorientation of humanities within the institutional framework of universities has not taken place. So let us go back to Marshall McLuhan and his critique of the traditional educational system. McLuhan himself rarely talked about new concepts of education, staying mostly with his historical descriptions in order to make his contemporaries aware of the cultural impact of new technologies. But one of his readers during the 1970s thought he had the right instrument at his disposal to draw the conclusions from McLuhan's media studies and to turn the educational system upside down. I'm talking of Alan Kay, the architect of the graphical user interface at Xerox PARC and Apple Incorporated. In a 1984 article published in Scientific American entitled Computer Software, he declared, "Any medium powerful enough to extend man's reach is powerful enough to topple his world." End quote. The medium to which Kay was referring was computer software, which via object-oriented programming would transform the computer from a calculating machine into a medium or supermedium of all kinds of cultural practices. As Kay conceived it, the next step with such a concept of software should enable the educational system to make the transition from paper and pencil literacy to computer literacy, which, as Kay emphasizes in his article, and I quote again, should be attained as early as possible. Children should not be made to wait until they can get in a half year of it just before they graduate from high school, as recent reports by educational commissions suggest. Children need informational shoes, bicycles, cars, and airplanes from the moment they start to explore the universe of knowledge. End quote. This move by Alan Kay around 1980 from description to designing has obviously proved very successful because we are living today in a world largely built of computer-generated objects or user illusions, as Kay says in his article. In his highly controversial 1993 essay, Es gibt keine Software, There is no software, Friedrich Kittler incriminated Kay's strategy as false abstraction from the concrete hardware of the digital machine and its complexity. What he saw was a misappropriation and economic privatization of a mathematical machine which originally belonged to scientists and not to business entities. His counter-proposal can be found in a 2003 English-written essay entitled Universities, Wet, Hard, Soft, and Harder. It portrays the computer as the new and unifying media system for a university liberated from subjection to the modern nation-state and returning to the independence it enjoyed in medieval times. Quote, "Universities have finally succeeded in forming once again a complete media system. Turing's universal machine, vulgo the computer, processes, stores, and transmits whatever data it receives, whether textbooks, measurements, or algebras. Computers, therefore, have come full circle from the mathematics departments where they once began, making their way through physics, chemistry, and medicine. They have finally arrived in the humanities. For the second time in its 8 centuries, the university is technically uniform, simply because all departments share one and the same hardware. End of quote. What we find here is the description of a computer or network community, which is quite different from what we know as the capitalist version of the internet. It is a computer network beyond all commercialized platforms that is used only by scholars, scientists, and engineers, an advanced research projects agency network, or ARPANET, like the one that interconnected American universities and research institutes between 1969 and 1983. I quote again from that article. Actual knowledge needs places to produce, store, and transmit itself independently of any company. What better places are there than universities? This applies just as much to digitally processed data as to the digitalized data of history. In the first case, the plans of enormous scientific publishing houses to monopolize academic journals in their hands are probably doomed to failure because PhD advisors getting at the data much earlier can publish them electronically. The same holds true for free source code. In the more trivial case of formerly analog data, sounds and images, their future seems to be up to the gods. Whether or not arts and treasures of bygone cultures can be saved from private digital rights does not seem to be of primary concern. Whereas in Gutenberg's time, the university had to renounce its storage monopoly, its leading role in processing and transmitting now remains as crucial as ever. Only if envious states succeed in persuading the university in general and cultural studies, Kulturwissenschaften in particular, to think of themselves as mere compensation and a mere assessment of the consequences of technology, will 8 centuries from Bologna to Stanford have passed in vain. The sciences are too good merely to avert attention from what science does. End of quote. What science does. This phrase is decisive here and brings us back to our initial question as to whether Friedrich Kittler's media studies include a concept of Bildung in the age of information. Because science is doing something, because it does not only have a history, but is our history, the history of being, it can be looked upon as a poetic or poietic process. And this is the task of media studies or Kulturwissenschaften, which for Friedrich Kittler were the only possible successor of philosophy on the academic throne, overseeing all the other university disciplines. In his essay on the digitalized university, Friedrich Kittler points out that Kulturwissenschaften, which in fact are nothing but a synonym for the humanities adapted to the age of information, can also be called knowledge of knowledges or Wissenswissenschaften. This is the reason why I would like to draw on Jean-François Lyotard's book La Condition Postmoderne in the last few minutes of my talk. The grand narratives, which according to Lyotard have disintegrated since the end of the 19th century, are 2 modern legitimizations of knowledge: the French revolutionary narrative of the emancipation of the people by a public educational system, and the German ontological narrative of the evolvement of the spirit or Geist within the history of sciences. The spirit's institutional form is the university. It is obvious how much Friedrich Kittler's blueprint of the digitalized university owes to Humboldt's and Hegel's concept. The retroactive rewriting of the history of knowledge from the vantage point of the age of information is a legitimization of the history of science and technology in itself. But can the university continue to be this universe of all knowledge? With Lyotard, we find a different description of what happens to the university in postmodern times. I quote, "The moment knowledge ceases to be an end in itself, the realization of the idea or the emancipation of man, its transmission is no longer exclusive. It's no longer the exclusive responsibility of scholars and students. The notion of university frankness now belongs to a bygone era, end quote. So what vanishes today, according to Lyotard, is the university as an exclusive community for teaching and learning. It is replaced by a technical system of data processing extending more or less throughout society. I quote, "The relation to knowledge is not articulated in terms of realization of the life of the spirit or the emancipation of humanity, but in terms of the users of a complex conceptual and material machinery and those who benefit from its performance capabilities. They have at their disposal no meta-language or meta-narrative in which to formulate the final goal and correct use of that machinery, but they do have brainstorming to improve its performance. The process of delegitimation and the predominance of the performance criterion are sounding the knell to the age of the professor. A professor is no more competent than memory bank networks in transmitting established knowledge, nor more competent than interdisciplinary teams in imagining new moves or new games." End quote. When Friedrich Kittler talked about paideia in his last public appearance in July 2011, he had only disdain for the new, forgetful German university with its anglicized Latin academic titles. At the same time, he evoked the community of scholars and students as a mode of existence and as the indispensable core of the humanities. So the unfashionable undertone of his concept of media studies or Kulturwissenschaften could clearly be heard. Paideia or Bildung should not be transferred to the machines because each scholar, as he said, quoting Nietzsche, in a gesture of Dionysian self-fashioning, has to become a single regulating system, which is fueled with illusions, one-sidedness, passions, and which is prevented from overheating by the help of conscious science. So, at the end, education can only be self-education, starting from our own idiosyncrasies and cooling them down by algorithmic strictness. Der letzte große aus dem 19. Jahrhundert was the headline of an obituary for Friedrich Kittler in the newspaper Die Welt when he died in October 2011. The last great figure from the 19th century. I think this is true in many respects because it seems it was his commitment to the university of the 1800s that tuned his radar to the demise of its legitimacy and to the necessity of re-establishing the humanities through recourse to the media culture of the 20th century. So contrary to a widespread criticism, Friedrich Kittler's media studies were not claiming the end of scholarship and Bildung in the age of information, but instead were an attempt to revise and to revive it. But when saying this, we should not forget that for Friedrich Kittler, giving a historic description never meant to establish an authoritative tradition, but to get rid of what had been described and thus formalized. So the ethos or pathos of his media studies can finally be compared to the plot of a mystery story. Unraveling the mystery always means closing the case. I thank you very much for your patience.
We are now open to questions.
Thank you so much for thought-provoking and important intervention. I don't want to discuss with you the age of the professor.
Okay. I agree.
Do you agree? having just celebrated my 29th birthday. So, So I wonder if, first of all, thank you. It's extremely rich, and the movements you track and drive us to confront, from description to designing, are very, very important, certainly in terms of philosophical dossiers that push the envelope of description but haven't made certain leaps that you describe and perhaps advocate in wonderfully ambivalent ways. So I'm wondering if you're willing to consider with me the following, which is to say let's say the launch pad of Bildung, that I think, if I'm not mistaken, if you take the twin motors of Hegel's phenomenology and Goethe's transposition in Wilhelm Meister, that require structurally kind of encounter, an extreme encounter with negative firewalls of being and traumatic traversals that promise a certain erasure of smooth kinds of transitions, or a relation to the possibility of maybe non-knowledge as well as knowledge, maybe non-understandings in Schlegel's important essay, as well as intelligibility and so on. So is there something, do you suppose, when you try to update the windows of Bildung, that has to get like, are you losing the training wheels of Bildung, in the sense that Bildung used to also imply at least a symbolic kind of, used in a street sense, symbolic now, a symbolic run-up against death? Do you think when moving, these are simple questions, and maybe you do or don't want to engage some of these ports and portals. Do you think that, and by the way, a sidebar, we may not have time to discuss that McLuhan's thought on education was given to Playboy. Okay, back to out of the bunny place that we began with our nervous little bunny ears already. That's what I meant as well. So these would be some of my remarks and observations, whether or not you wish to take them, but do take my thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Avital, for this comment and intervention. Yeah, I only can say that I didn't want to go into a philosophy or theory of Bildung or education, but I just wanted to highlight that there is this, in Kittler's writings, there's this permanent institutional framework he's addressing to. And this, for me, is really interesting, and it says a lot about his thinking. And this struggling and trying to transform this institutional framework without really kind of maybe success in a political sense, but I would say on an epistemological level, he was very successful. But this comes, I would say, from this struggling with the academic framework, and I just wanted to highlight this. And it also seems to me a permanent subject or underlying leitmotif for all media studies, also for the Canadian media studies. They are always dealing with education, and they situate themselves on a rupture between two ages or eras of education, and their task is to find new paths or new forms of education. I just wanted to highlight this, not to go into a philosophy of, or.
But now I'm inviting you to go there.
Yeah, I'm resisting.
I thought I was going to resist reintroducing Goethe into the conversation until your last gesture, when the prototypical literary genre you mentioned was, correct me if I'm wrong, the mystery novel. And I was wondering, because you brought up the novel, and we're talking about Bildung, and because Kittler has a relationship in the early work to Wilhelm Meister, why you didn't mention Wilhelm Meister, which seems to be rife with all of the problems of definition, of progeny, and so on and so forth, that we're talking about with respect to media studies. And I'm wondering if Wilhelm Meister might not be read rather than as the prototypical Bildungsroman, as the prototypical media roman. What is there, if any, connection in terms of your analysis now, which I appreciated very much, with reference to Humboldt and so on and so forth? What is there, if anything, to be mined in Wilhelm Meister for this kind of discussion?
Yeah, thank you. Really, thank you very much for this question. And yes, maybe I really forgot this to mention it here because, but for me, it could be included in the Discourse Network's 1800-1900 project. Friedrich Kittler, he wrote years before that this text Dichtung als Sozialisationsspiel. And for me, it's a bit, it's the early Kittler. It's not the Foucauldian and Lacanian Kittler. It's more or less the psychoanalytic Kittler. But yeah, it's an argument for my talk here. That is a permanent underlying motive and problem in his writing.
Just one more small point in the same direction. First of all, I really very much appreciate what you have said about the implications for education on the higher level, on the academic level. I mean, the one point I wanted to ask how you see that as, because you mentioned Wilhelm Meister als Sozialisationsspiel, one couldn't imagine that Kittler had written something like the PC as a Sozialisationsspiel. I mean, he would have just horrified the idea. I mean, everything you mentioned about his scorn for certain type of software is, so to speak, declaring that as what he analyzed in the Romantic era as perhaps something which was deplorable for him, but a major historical force, as a kind of a nuisance and for the new media era. Is can one say anything about that?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's the reason why I mentioned Alan Kay, because he's really an interesting figure, because he really invented great parts of our world today, and he did this by referring to Jean Piaget via it's Seymour Papert, disciple of Piaget's. And so, our world is built out of this pedagogy, from Geneva, and transferred here to California, and that would be the Wilhelm Meister novel of today, and one should write it, or it could be written. Yeah. Maybe it's the farce of the Wilhelm Meister novel.
Thanks so much for your talk. I find it especially striking that the progression from Geisteswissenschaften to Wissenswissenschaften would have to take place, at least in the arc that you presented, through the mediation of this term Kultur. So I just wanted to ask you a little more about Kultur, or culture, if you think that culture is an acceptable translation for Kultur. Is it an anthropological culture in any sense? Does it have anything to do with high culture? Is it organic? Is there any kind of totality? Is one kind of in culture, or does one produce or consume culture? Maybe does it have anything to do with the culture wars? And what's the sort of, these are many questions, you can take as many or as few as you want. And what's the sort of, the place of the human? Is there a privilege of the human in the domain of culture, or what's the relationship between the human and the non-human, the machine, the animal, in culture?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's, I think it doesn't lead anywhere if we try to define Kittlerian concept of culture, but one can say that you have to hear within this word also Kulturwissenschaften the cultural techniques. So it's a version of his media studies, and it's a view upon cultural history gone through media studies. So this is what I would say. And as we heard yesterday, we had this talk about Friedrich Kittler's oeuvre and the early early piece where he invented something that seems to be the later Kittler in a nutshell. But I think especially when we look upon the concept of cultural studies or Kulturwissenschaften with Kittler, we can see that the real structure of his work or oeuvre has the form of a loop. He always comes back to himself and revises his own theory, and what has been first called media studies is later called, or it's transferred to Kulturwissenschaften. It's not a synonym, but it's the way he transformed himself, his theory over the years. And so, this recursive structure, following the recursive structure of his thinking. And so, I think there is no really definition of Kultur here in Kulturwissenschaften. It's maybe one could say it's a kind of a second order observation of the traditional Kulturwissenschaften from the vantage point of media studies. So maybe that.
I wonder if you could comment in connection with your topic on the, if you'll allow me the phrase, the anti-statism of Kittler's work. If I recall the essay that you cited by him, essay is perhaps an exaggerated term for that, small, is it a contribution in critical inquiry, is that what it is?
Yes, it is.
Yes. One could summarize the thesis by saying that the fall from paradise of the university was their integration into the state.
Exactly.
They are becoming a state institution.
Yeah.
The lifelong fondness for über die Zukunft unserer Bildungsanstalten that Bernhard talked about is a fondness for a vigorous anti-statist conception of education. The central idea of Aufschreibsysteme is the idea of the production of the civil servant in suspension between Mutterschaft on the one hand and the state on the other. So we have this is a running motif. Yeah. It would seem to me to be diametrically opposed to a set of suggestions for the improvement of our state institutions of education, such as we have in the Scientific American article that you cited, or for that matter in Lyotard's report for the Canadian government. So if you could comment on this status theme, I would be grateful.
Okay, yes. I will try to do that. First, one have to say you're absolutely right. It's permanent in his writings, and this kind of idiosyncrasy or affect against the state. there. First reference I would make here is surely Deleuze-Guattari's Mille Plateaux. So the war machine, which is confronted with the state machine, and I think this would be one trace one could follow, but maybe. I had that remark towards the American theory included into French theory. So Shannon, Wiener, and John von Neumann, and maybe there we have a kind of theory, the game theory, information theory, and cybernetics. Especially cybernetics, which is it's an anti national state concept. So it's a totally different concept of governing we find here in cybernetics, and in an interesting way this comes up with Kittler's writing. So this American concept of a governing. Of a technologically governing. I think this is also present in Kittler's writing, and it comes in by these concepts or theories, positions. I don't know whether this can be really an answer for your question.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.